The Rebbe became a Rebbe in 1951. To take a position of a leader of the Jewish people in 1951 could not have been a fun job, you understand? It wasn't exactly the right time to take the job. The thing about the Rebbe is that when he took the job, he never for a moment saw himself as the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The previous Rebbe, his father-in-law, when he came to America, he felt that when he came here, he became responsible for all the Jews in the world. Certainly all the Jews in America. When the Rebbe became Rebbe, his attitude was, and it became the foundation of what Chabad is today, is that Chabad is not a movement that concerns itself with itself. Chabad is a movement that concerns itself with all the Jewish people in the world. But in 1950, this was the idea was so radical, it was so unusual, and the Rebbe didn't have any people. I mean, Lubavitch was the Lubavitcher Chassidim either came from the Soviet Union or came from the Holocaust. What did the Rebbe have? And the Rebbe set a course for himself that was extraordinarily ambitious. I mean, to undertake what the Rebbe undertook, you have to have a lot of faith. And the nature of the faith is, you're not allowed to think how it's going to work out. You have to just think that you got to do. You know, the Rebbe's our Chabad Reim, you say all the time in Yiddish, Medaf ton, medaf nish ufton. It's our job to do. What happens is God's business. To be able to have this vision, to take on the world at that time with the optimism and the vision for the future that the Rebbe had, you have to have extraordinary emunah. So much emunah, so much faith. And the nature of the faith has to be blind. What do I have to do? How it's going to work out, how it's going to end, how it's going to benefit people. I can't think about that because I'll get too depressed. You have to just work. And that's the secret. That's how the Rebbe built Lubavitch with no people, no connections, nothing. But he had this unbelievable emunah that the Eber Hashem, God Almighty, will give strength, and it's worked out pretty good. 70 years on, if you know what I'm saying. Anyway, but I wanted to share this with you. For the first 20 years after the Rebbe became a Rebbe, 25 years, the Rebbe used to see people in private. 3 nights a week, 2 nights a week. He would sit till the morning and people would come and talk to him. A lot of the people who came to see the Rebbe were Eli Wiesels, were broken people. And they would come to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe would talk to them, and they would walk out of the Rebbe's room like they took a shower, you understand? Like they washed it all off. I'm going to tell you, I'm sorry I'm so emotional, it's not appropriate. I'm the only man in the room, the only one crying. I just want to tell you one more story. This is a very interesting story. This story happened in the 1970s. In other words, more than 30 years after the war. There was a man living in Australia, his name was Mr. Moss. He's no longer alive. His son has told the story. Mr. Moss. Mr. Moss in the old country was a Munkach Bocher. Munkach was a Chassidus. Munkach, I don't know how much you know. A very, very strong Chassidic group in Munkach. The Munkach Rebbe was one of the great Rebbes of the pre-war world, one of the greatest people of his time. His name was Achei Shapiro of Munkach, the Munkach Rebbe. And Mr. Moss knew the Munkach Rebbe as a teenager. He learned in his yeshiva. He survived the war. Also as an adolescent, around the same age as Elie Wiesel, maybe a little bit older. And he immigrated to Australia. And he swore to himself that he will never see the inside of a shul, ever. He came to Australia with a shirt on his back, with nothing. And he became a very, very rich man, became incredibly, incredibly wealthy. He got married. He had a bunch of kids. I don't know how many kids. And then his wife died on top of everything else. So he had to raise his children alone. You understand? The Holocaust survivor. He had a lot of pain. But he made a lot of money. He was a very, very rich man. And then his life was ruined, Nebuch, because one of his sons went off to yeshiva. And I sat with this boy. He was here in America once, and I asked him to tell the story. I saw him tell the story on a screen, on a video, and I asked him to repeat it to me face to face. He said he lived in Sydney, and he moved to Melbourne, and Melbourne was a yeshiva. This is the late 60s, early 70s. His son went to yeshiva. And his father was very upset. Because his father raised him with no Yiddishkeit at all. Nothing. No Yom Kippur, no nothing. And he went to yeshiva. And he said to me, Mr. Moss, the son, that he once came home from yeshiva, and his father, who hadn't been in a shul in 30 years, asked him what Talmudic tractate he's studying, what page of Gemara he's learning. So he told his father what page, and his father recited the entire page by heart, from memory, what he learned in Munkach in the 1930s. Now you're talking the early 70s. He remembered the Torah that he learned, but he didn't want his children to have any of it. So he came to Rabbi Groner, Olav Shalom, who was the head of the school in Melbourne. And he said, Rabbi Groner, my son doesn't belong in yeshiva, and I'm a very rich man. I'll give you a lot of money. Kick him out of the yeshiva. Kick him. I don't want my son to learn yeshiva. I'll give you whatever you want. Kick him out of yeshiva. So Rabbi Groner said to him, I was sent by the Rebbe from New York to Melbourne to make a yeshiva. My purpose is to keep Bacham in yeshiva. I appreciate your money, but I'm not going to kick him out of yeshiva. So Mr. Moss decided that he's going to travel to New York. He's going to meet the Rebbe, and he's going to give the Rebbe a lot of money and get his son out of the yeshiva. If it's not going to work with Rabbi Groner, let Rabbi Groner's boss. To make a long story short, on his way to New York, he stops in Paris. Must have flown through Israel. This goes back to early 70s. He was a personal friend of Menachem Begin. But this is before Begin was prime minister. Begin was still in the opposition. But it was before he was prime minister. He was part of the opposition. For the first 35 years, Israel was single-party rule. It was all, whatever they called it then. It was the left. Begin was always part of the opposition. Begin was really a firm person. Begin kept Shabbos, ate kosher. And Mr. Moss met him in Paris. And Begin asked him where he's going to eat Friday night. Shabbat. Yeah. He says, I have no place to go. He says, come with me to my hotel. And he had to walk 2 miles because Mr. Begin wouldn't drive in a car. Mr. Moss wasn't used to walking 2 miles through a hot street. And he asked Menachem Begin, which Jew in the post-Holocaust world does he respect the most? And Menachem Begin told him the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Now he's on his way to New York to meet the Lubavitcher Rebbe, to get his son out of the Lubavitcher Rebbe yeshiva. And Menachem Begin tells him that the person in the world he respects most is the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So he says, why? Who's the Lubavitcher Rebbe? So he said the Lubavitcher Rebbe taught the Jewish people how to live again. Yeah. How to live again. Anyways, he comes to New York, Mr. Moss. But he came with a recommendation, you understand? He knew already that the Rebbe is not some little kid that he's going to play over, a rabbi with a beard and to give him a check. He went into the Rebbe, and the Rebbe asked him to sit. So he said to the Rebbe, I was in Munkach. Munkach is a city. And Munkach was a big Rebbe. He says, by a Rebbe you don't sit. He tells the Rebbe, by a Rebbe you don't sit. So the Rebbe says to him, if you're not going to sit, I'm not going to sit. And they stood. They stood the whole time. And he didn't get a chance to even ask why he came. He came to get his son out of the yeshiva. And the Rebbe says to him, tell me about Munkach. Tell me about the yeshiva. The Rebbe revered his Rebbe. Our Rebbe held of the Munkach Rebbe incredibly. I mean, one of the few people that I would quote all the time was his Rebbe, the Mechas Alazar. So the Rebbe starts asking him about the yeshiva and about the schedule and what they learned and what they did on the weekends, what they did in vacation. The Rebbe asked him many, many questions about the yeshiva. And slowly, without him realizing it, he talked him towards the war. The Munkach Rebbe passed away in 36. The Munkach Rebbe passed away before the war. So he knew the Munkach Rebbe before. He passed away in 1936. The war was 41, 40. I mean, he was hungry. It was a little bit later. And the Rebbe slowly got him to the war. and what happened next. And this man hadn't spoken about the war his entire life. He never said a word about his experience. And the Rebbe slowly got him talking about the war and where he was and where they ran and how they hid and when the Nazis took over Hungary and how he survived. And the Rebbe got to talk about something he hadn't spoken about probably in 35 years. And at some point, the volcano erupted, For the first time, this man let it out. And he started to cry uncontrollably. The Rebbe came out from behind his desk and he embraced him. When he was leaving the Rebbe's room, the Rebbe said to him, whatever he called him, I don't know his name. He said to him in Yiddish, he said to him, it'll be good. It was 30 years after the war. It was many, many years after. It'll be good. It'll be good. Anyway, he never asked his son to leave the yeshiva.